He was the man who taught the world to imagine peace, the sharpest wit among the Beatles, a man whose very name became a synonym for hope, and then he simply vanished for 18 months at the very height of his fame, disappearing from the world that worshipped him. A true ghost in the machine of rock and roll, a legend choosing silence over the roar, and we have only ever been left with rumours and a strange heavy quiet that no one has ever fully been able to explain. So just how far can a myth unravel in the darker, alone before no one recognises the man on the floor as the boy they once loved? Because beneath the sainthood the world has carved for him, there was a man tearing himself apart in ways we were never meant to see. October 1973. The man who had once stood at the centre of the world's most famous band, the man whose face had been projected onto the screens of a generation, quietly walked out of the Dakota building and did not look back. The separation from Yoko Ono was not a clean break but a slow, creeping unravelling, the kind that leaves a man standing in the ruins of his own life without a map. Behind him lay a legal nightmare that had been grinding through the American courts since March of 1972. When the US government issued an order to have him deported, a threat that hung over his head like a blade suspended by a single thread. His lawyer, Leon Wilders, had managed to stay the execution with an appeal, but the psychological toll of knowing that your entire existence in a country could be erased at any moment is a poison that seeps into everything. And into this void stepped a 23-year-old woman named May Pang, a former assistant to Yoko Ono, who was handed the strangest assignment of her life. In her memoir Loving John, published in 1983, Pang described the scene with a clarity that still stings. Yoko Ono called her into the room, looked at her with those implacable eyes, and said John needs someone to take care of him. And then, just like that, Ono withdrew from Lennon's life entirely, leaving Pang to fill a role that no human being should have been asked to fill. For 18 months, Pang would serve as his cook, his lover, his manager, and as she put it, his mother, an experience she later described as the best and the worst time of my life. Think about the sheer strangeness of that arrangement for a moment. A wife hands her husband over to another woman, not out of anger or jealousy, but with what appeared to be a calculated sense of control. What kind of marriage operates like that? What kind of man allows himself to be managed so completely that even his rebellion becomes a curated performance? Lennon, the man who had once told the world to imagine no possessions, had become a possession himself, passed from one caretaker to another. The deeper tragedy was that Lennon seemed to recognise his own powerlessness, but could not find the will to fight it. He had spent years projecting an image of radical independence, the working-class hero who had torn himself free from the factory floors of Liverpool, only to find himself at 33, alone in a city he barely knew, with his legal fate in the hands of a lawyer he had never heard of, and his emotional fate in the hands of a woman who was following his wife's orders. The pressure was not just legal, it was existential. Every day that he stayed in America was a day he was technically defying a deportation order, living on borrowed time in a country that had once welcomed him as a genius and now treated him as a problem to be solved. During that time, Pang recalled, there were moments when Lennon would sit in silence for hours, staring at nothing, his mind somewhere far away, unreachable. The magic had not yet gone out of his voice, but it was fading, like a photograph left too long in the sun. By the time October turned to November, the man who had written All You Need Is Love was beginning to wonder if he had anything left to say at all, and the real question was not whether he would fall, but how far the fall would take him. He had swapped the Dakota for a place on East 62nd Street, a short walk from the life he had abandoned, close enough to feel its pull, but far enough to drown. The apartment at 208 East 62nd Street became his bunker, a 2-kilometre buffer zone from the woman who still controlled the strings from her perch in the Dakota building. It was there that the legend of the gentle beetle began to curdle into something rawer, something harder to look at. The man who once sang about peace and love now spent his days staring at walls, his nights disappearing into a bottle. The distance between his old life and this new one was not measured in miles, but in the chasm between who he had been and who he was becoming. The drinking was not a pastime, it was a full-time occupation. A bottle of vodka or brandy a day became the rhythm of his existence, and some stretches blurred into days where he never really woke up at all. He would surface from these benders with no memory of the hours lost, only a hollow ache and a fresh stack of empty bottles to show for it. This was not the controlled indulgence of a rock star enjoying his spoils. It was a man methodically erasing himself, one drink at a time. The harshest truth was that the alcohol worked, at least for a while, numbing the noise in his head until there was nothing left but silence. But the silence was its own kind of horror, and it was in one of those quieter moments that he confessed to May Pang that he had lost the feeling for music entirely. The man who had redefined popular song, who had composed some of the most enduring melodies of the century, was now convinced he would never write again. He told her he thought his gift had evaporated, that the well had run dry, and he had no idea how to find it again. The sheer weight of that admission, spoken in a dimly lit room, might have been the most honest thing he had said in years. Here was the cruelest irony. The world still saw a genius, but he saw only a husk. The isolation that followed was self-imposed and absolute. He cut himself off from the three men who had once been his brothers in the Beatles, severing those final threads with a deliberate finality. The only connection he kept was with Ringo Starr, and that was less a choice than a convenience, born from the fact that they both ended up in Los Angeles seeking the same oblivion. It seemed he could tolerate the company of another broken soul, but not the reminder of what he had once built and then destroyed. Was this the price of genius, to be so utterly alone at the very moment you had the most to lose? The phone rarely rang, and when it did, it was usually the voice of the woman who had put him here, checking in on her experiment. The physical decay mirrored the internal ruin, a grotesque spectacle that he could no longer hide. The lean, sharp-featured revolutionary had swollen to nearly 90 kilograms, a dramatic shift from the 68 kilograms he had weighed just months earlier. He was ashamed of what he saw in the mirror, and the shame kept him indoors, away from the cameras and the public who still expected a god. The weight was not just fat, it was the physical manifestation of his despair, a monument to his collapse. He avoided the windows, avoided the streets, and avoided the piercing gaze of a world that would not recognize the man behind the bloated face. Yet, in the very heart of this fog, a strange and beautiful thing clawed its way to the surface. From the depths of his misery, a song emerged, one that captured the raw, unvarnished state of his soul. It was not a song of hope or defiance, but a quiet, devastating admission of loneliness and self-pity. The music was still there, hiding beneath the wreckage, and it spilled out not despite the darkness, but because of it. The man who thought he had lost his ability to create had just written one of the most painfully honest tracks of his career, unwittingly proving that even at rock bottom, the artist could not be silenced, and that would be the thread that would lead him out, even as he was still falling. By April 1974, the chaos had a new zip code. Lennon and May Pang had traded the suffocating silence of their Manhattan apartment for Los Angeles, a city that seemed to run on sunlight, excess, and the kind of reckless energy that matched his new mood. He was there to reconnect with Ringo Starr, and the two of them would spend hours in the studio, drinking and recording songs that would never see the light of day. But this wasn't a working holiday, it was an open-ended fall, and everyone in his orbit could feel the ground rushing up to meet them. Just a month before the move, in March 1974, the ground had already started to shake. Lennon and Harry Nilsson were thrown out of the Troubadour Club in Los Angeles after a drunken outburst, their target a woman from the Smothers Brothers act. The picture of a Beatle being physically escorted into the street was a public humiliation that would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier. This wasn't the peace-loving visionary of Imagine. This was a man who had swapped the global stage for a sticky, flawed bar fight, and the trade felt disturbingly easy for him to make. The real nadir, however, was the album he was supposed to be producing. Lennon had agreed to produce Pussy Cats for his friend Nilsson, but the sessions became a case study in self-destruction. Nilsson himself would later recall it as a drunken nightmare, describing nights that stretched until 4 a.m, when they'd call each other up to debate the meaning of music. He told the press of their state with a bleak honesty. We weren't human beings anymore. We were two singing corpses. The album that emerged from these sessions, released in August 1974, was a cracked mirror reflecting their disarray, a testament to what happens when talent is drowned in a bottle. But even in this freefall, the universe threw him a curveball. In June 1974, in that same Los Angeles, Lennon found himself in a studio with Paul McCartney. It was a jam session, a moment of shared history, but it wasn't a reunion. It was the last time the two songwriting titans would ever be in the same room together. You have to wonder, didn't that stark geography of their broken partnership hit him like a physical blow? As the years of acrimony stretched on, he was becoming more of a ghost to the world he'd helped create, isolated with only a drinking buddy and a bottle for company. The pattern of his life in Los Angeles was one of increasingly wild swings between creative flashes and alcoholic stupors, yet a new current was running beneath the surface. In the middle of this haze, a serendipitous meeting on August 25, 1974, with a young David Bowie at a New York studio would prove to be the most consequential event of that season. While he was drowning in this California nightmare, the moment that would rewire his musical future was waiting for him in a different city, ready to pull him back into the light. The phone call that night was pure static chaos. Nilsson's voice slurred through the receiver, recounting how he'd just smashed a glass against the wall of the record plant because the engineer had dared to suggest they take a break. Lennon laughed so hard he nearly choked on his own drink. These were the moments that defined Pussycat's sessions. They'd stumble into the studio at 3 in the afternoon, reeking of brandy and regret. The producer, a young man named Phil Spector, had already fled the project. He couldn't handle the unpredictability. So Lennon took over the console himself, his fingers fumbling over knobs he knew by heart but could barely see. The tape would roll, the band would play a few bars, then someone would knock over a mic stand, and the whole thing would dissolve into laughter. They captured something raw in those fragmented takes, but at what cost? The Troubadour incident felt like a fever dream now. Lennon remembered the red velvet booths, the way the stage lights glinted off the glasses of whiskey lined up in front of him. He'd been heckling the Smothers Brothers opening act, shouting obscenities that echoed through the crowded room. When the bouncer grabbed his arm, Lennon swung, missing entirely and landing on his own face. The carpet tasted like stale beer and floor wax. Nilsson was yelling something about freedom of speech while being dragged backward by 2 security guards. The newspaper wrote it up as Beatle goes berserk, and for weeks people would approach him on the street with a knowing grin, asking if he remembered that night. He didn't, not all of it. Ringo came by the rented house on the beach once, carrying a 6-pack and a new song he'd been working on. They sat on the balcony, watching the waves roll in and out like the tide of their own lives. Ringo looked older, warier, but the same kindness flickered in his eyes. They recorded 3 tracks together in a tiny studio downtown, but Lennon kept laughing at the wrong moments, and the engineer grew frustrated. When Ringo left, the silence in the house was deafening. Lennon sat there, the ocean staring back at him, and wondered if he'd ever make music that mattered again. The phone rang. It was Harry, suggesting they go find some trouble. He was already half out the door, before the thought could fully form in his head. That's when the call came from New York. A young, sharp-voiced producer named David Caruso was on the line, saying something about a session with David Bowie. The name rang a bell, but Lennon's mind was foggy. Bowie, the guy with the red hair and the strange fashion sense. His song Space Oddity had been on the radio a few years back. Caruso was insistent, telling Lennon that Bowie wanted to work with him. "Make it happen," Lennon mumbled before hanging up, not believing it ever would. But the date was set, August 25, 1974. The city would be different, the people different, but maybe that was exactly what he needed. He didn't know it yet, but the nightmare was about to slingshot him into a rebirth. In the summer of 1974, just as his personal life was spiralling into the darkest chapter of his career, John Lennon found an unexpected lifeline in the form of a piano-driven rocker. Elton John walked into the studio in July of that year, and the 2 men cut Whatever Gets You Through the Night, marking the first time Lennon had ever collaborated with a musician outside the Beatles. That single, born from a moment of pure creative instinct, would go on to become his first and only #1 hit in America during his lifetime, a fact that seemed impossible for a man who had spent months convinced he was finished. Yet the very success of the song forced Lennon into a corner, because Elton had made him a deal. If the record reached the top of the charts, Lennon would have to come on stage and perform it live with him. That promise led to the night of November 28, 1974, when Lennon walked out onto the stage of Madison Square Garden in New York, a venue he knew well, but this time his hands were shaking. Elton John recalled, in an interview with Rolling Stone the following year, that Lennon was terrified to the point of trembling, and that he had to down half a bottle of brandy just to steady himself before stepping into the spotlight. It was the last live performance Lennon would ever give, and the irony was not lost on anyone who knew the state he was in, because the man who had once commanded stadiums with the Beatles was now a nervous wreck, held together by alcohol and sheer willpower. The audience roared, the song soared, and for those few minutes on that November evening, the legend seemed to flicker back to life, only to vanish again into the haze of his lost months. Barely 3 months earlier, on August 25, 1974, Lennon had found himself in a New York studio with David Bowie, a collaboration that would produce the track Fame, a song that Bowie would release and take to the top of the charts. Lennon's contribution was more than just a vocal turn. He co-wrote the lyrics and helped shape the funky, sharp-edged sound that became one of Bowie's defining hits of the decade. Here was a man who, by his own admission, had lost all feeling for music, yet he was casually helping to craft some of the most memorable records of the era. It was a contradiction that seemed to define his entire existence during those 18 months, because the genius that had made him a god to millions was still firing on all cylinders, while the human being carrying that genius was slowly falling apart. Even the quieter moments of creation during this period carried a strange, dreamlike quality, none more so than the song Tonight Dream, which Lennon wrote based on a bizarre vision he had of a wordless melody floating through his sleep. It was a gentle, hypnotic track that felt like a whisper from another world, and it became the last song he would complete before he eventually returned to Yoko Ono. The album it appeared on, Walls and Bridges, was recorded and released in 1974, and it stood as proof that his artistic well was far from dry, even as his emotional one had been poisoned at the source. But here is the cruel twist that shadows every moment of this tale, because no matter how bright these creative sparks burned, they could not illuminate the darkness that had settled over his daily life. The man who was writing these beautiful songs was the same man who would soon appear on a television screen, looking vacant and detached, a ghost of himself, and the viewers who saw that broadcast had no idea they were watching a legend who had already stopped believing in his own resurrection. There is a clinical name for what was happening to him, a term that strips the romance from the wreckage. In 2013, Psychology Today published an analysis that framed John Lennon's behaviour during those 18 months as a textbook case of burnout syndrome, that specific kind of emotional and mental exhaustion born from relentless artistic pressure. He was not merely being wild, he was displaying the symptoms of a man whose internal resources had been completely depleted, a condition that often precedes a total collapse. The diagnosis of clinical depression was also made during this period, though Lennon refused any form of treatment, choosing instead to self-medicate with the very substances that were deepening his despair. It is a painful irony that a man who preached peace and mindfulness to the world could not extend that same grace to the vulnerable machinery of his own mind. He would tell friends that Yoko Ono was the only person who truly understood him, a statement of profound devotion that collided with the reality of their situation. The very woman he professed to need so desperately was the one who had orchestrated his relationship with another, a contradiction that must have corroded his sense of self from the inside. How do you reconcile the image of your soulmate with the person who has pushed you into the arms of someone else? Yoko, for her part, maintained a strange and constant presence even from a distance, asserting in interviews that she kept tabs on Lennon through daily phone calls, fully aware of his every move even as they lived just 2 kilometers apart. This was not a separation, but a strange, extended leash, keeping him tethered to her will, even while he was ostensibly free. In his darker moments he sought escape in Eastern philosophy, reading extensively on Buddhism and meditation, searching for the stillness that had eluded him his entire life. But the practice, as he later admitted, was abandoned because it was too difficult to apply while drunk, a confession that reveals the depth of his entrapment. He was a man reaching for a lifeline with one hand, while the other was still wrapped around a bottle, the contradiction paralysing his attempts at recovery. It was in this state of profound isolation and confusion that he would sit down and write what might be his most honest confession. The song that emerged from this wreckage was a slow, aching composition called "Nobody Loves You When You're Down and Out," a track recorded for the Walls and Bridges album that served as a direct, unflinching mirror to his own shattered psyche. The title itself was not a clever observation, but a raw first-person account of his reality, a message from a man who had lost his way and could not find a way back to the genius he once was. He would sit for hours in the dimly lit studio, the scent of stale whiskey and cigarette smoke clinging to his clothes, watching the recording tape spin with a detached, clinical curiosity. His eyes, once sharp with the fire of rebellion, now held the hollow glaze of a man observing his own life from a great unreachable distance, as if he were a character in a film he no longer wanted to direct. When a session musician made an error, he didn't yell or correct them. He would simply stare at the mixing board, murmuring that it sounded fine, a word that had become his verbal tombstone. The decline is crushing because it wasn't a dramatic fall, but a slow, quiet erosion of standard, a meticulous dismantling of his professional and personal identity that mirrored the internal decay he was too fatigued to acknowledge. Why does the world so often mistake physical absence for emotional release, when the true horror lies in a soul that has simply stopped fighting to be present? The daily phone calls were a ritual he feared to break, a lifeline he hated but craved, create a paradox of dependence that suffocated his masculinity. With Pang sitting across the room pretending to read a magazine, he would listen to Ono's voice dissect his day, his meals, his menstrual cycle of creativity, knowing she was cataloguing his every move and every hesitation. He never swore at her, never hung up abruptly. It was the passivity of a captive who has learned that any resistance only tightens the cage. His knuckles growing white around the receiver as he whispered his compliance. This was a psychological warfare conducted over long-distance lines, where every "I miss you" from Ono was a tactical strike designed to keep him off balance, while her earlier suggestion to explore Pang served as an open wound he kept probing in the dark hours. Here the harshest truth surfaces. His own invention, the myth of his genius, was the primary source of his torture. He had built his reputation on authenticity, aggressively rejecting the Beatles' polish for raw emotion, but now he had nothing raw left to offer, only a hollowed-out caricature. This guilt led to a bizarre form of self-sabotage, where he would deliberately contradict his therapist's advice just to feel the rebellion of a disobedient child. Once, upon being told he needed to accept his longing for Yoko, he retorted that he missed his mother more, a cutting statement that left the expert scrambling for a response, while he felt a perverse, fleeting sense of victory. In the end, the only salve was the studio, where he could transfer the pain into something tangible, converting his burnout into a mournful melody. The distance between his real life and his art began to shrink until they were indistinguishable, both distorted, both circling the drain of a failed recovery. He became a curator of his own misery, stacking his records like tombstones of the past, knowing that the world expected sorrow from the broken Beatle. And then he would press play on the final take, listening to his own voice croak out the line about being down and out, and for a single ironic moment he felt a flicker of relief, thinking that perhaps the audience would finally see who he truly was. He was reaching through the music to beg for love, long after he had decided he no longer deserved any. May Pang was born in New York in 1950, a decade before the world would know her name, and by 1969 she was already working as a personal assistant at Alan Klein's company, A.B. Queso, the very firm that had entangled itself in the business of the Beatles' messy dissolution. She was the quiet, capable presence in the background of Lennon's life long before the chaos began, an observer of the marriage from a close and unusual vantage point. When Yoko Ono decided that John needed someone to look after him in the autumn of 1973, it was Pang she chose to hand him over to, a task that would define her for the next 18 months. The arrangement was odd from the start, but Pang stepped into it with a seriousness that surprised even herself, becoming cook, lover, manager and nurse to the most famous man on the planet. What began as a job of convenience would slowly turn into something far more complicated and far more intimate than either of them had expected. Lennon himself admitted, in the private moments he shared with Pang, and later recorded in her memoir, that he had completely lost control of his own impulses, that the relationship had overtaken him in ways he could not steer. Here was a man who had spent a decade as the most controlled and controlling figure in popular music, suddenly confessing that he was adrift in his own desires. The confession was not dramatic or theatrical, the way Lennon could sometimes be, but quiet, almost matter-of-fact, as if he had simply given up pretending to be the captain of his own ship. Pang, for her part, described the dynamic as feeling both gloriously freeing and quietly terrifying at the same time, because she knew she was holding something fragile in her hands. Their connection was built on the ruins of a marriage and a legend, yet it produced some of the only genuine warmth Lennon felt during this entire bleak period. In November of 1974, they flew to Hawaii together, and for the first time since he had become a Beatle, Lennon told Pang that he truly felt free, that the weight of the world had somehow lifted off his shoulders for a few precious days. The islands gave him something that Manhattan never could, an anonymity that was almost impossible for a man of his fame to find anywhere else on earth. They walked on the beaches without bodyguards, ate in small local diners where nobody recognized the gaunt, bearded man in the sunglasses, and Lennon laughed in a way that Pang had never heard him laugh before. He was not the peace icon, or the musical genius, or the wounded husband during that trip, but simply a man who had somehow escaped his own legend for a brief and shining moment. The memory of that freedom would stay with both of them long after the islands disappeared behind the clouds of the return flight. But their paradise had a hidden cost, because Lennon never once allowed himself to make the relationship public, never once offered Pang the dignity of being seen as anything more than his assistant. He would call her the best wife in the world during their private conversations, words that Pang held onto like precious coins. Yet the moment they stepped back into the world of cameras and questions, he would retreat into careful silence. The fear was not about scandal, but about Yoko, about damaging the carefully maintained image of his marriage that still defined so much of his public identity. So Pang lived a double life, the adored partner behind closed doors and the invisible woman in public, always smiling, always silent, always waiting. And then there were the children, Kyoko and Julian, the two kids who had been kept at such a distance during his years with Ono, and who suddenly entered his life in a way that surprised everyone. In this strange interlude, Lennon made a point of meeting and spending time with both of them, breaking a pattern of emotional distance that had meant so much to Ono. For Julian in particular, these were precious months of genuine fatherhood, something the boy had rarely experienced during the Beatles years. Yet even this warmth could not escape the shadow of the woman, whose approval Lindsay still sought, and whose absence seemed to hang over every gesture. The freedom was real, but it was borrowed, and the price of it was a silence that grew heavier with each passing week. On the 9th of October 1974, John Lennon woke up on his 34th birthday and made a decision that felt like a lifeline. He would stop drinking altogether, a resolution born from the blur of the previous months, yet one that he could only hold for a fleeting 3 months before the pull of the abyss returned. Just weeks earlier, on the 28th of August, he had lived what he would later describe as his worst day, the moment he learned that Neil Young and Joni Mitchell were both hospitalized from their own battles with substance abuse, a chilling mirror of his own trajectory that struck him with the force of a physical blow. In the middle of this turmoil, there was a strange flash of normalcy when he appeared as a guest on the Mike Douglas show on the 1st of June, a television moment that stands as his only American TV appearance during the entire Lost Weekend, where he seemed almost like the old Lennon, chatting and joking, a ghost of the man the world thought it knew. Beneath that surface, the destruction was bleeding money, with an estimated $500,000 going up in smoke on parties, alcohol and cigarettes, a figure that translates to over $3 million in today's money, all spent on fueling the very fire that was consuming him. Then came the decisive encounter in a Manhattan coffee shop in January 1975, a meeting that May Pang would never forget, for when Lennon and Ono sat down together, they did not speak for the first 10 minutes, the silence broken only when Lennon began to cry, and Ono reached across to hold his hand. A gesture that Pang later wrote was the moment she knew she had lost. The Lost Weekend officially ended in February 1975, when Lennon returned to the Dakota building, drawn back by Ono's phone call claiming she had discovered a way to cure him, and he walked away from Pang and the chaos as if waking from a long fever, but the scars of those 18 months would shadow every step he took in the years that followed. The sunrise on October 9, 1974, found John Lennon waking in a different condition than the one that had welcomed so many mornings before. It was his 34th birthday, and something in the weight of that number pressed against his chest like a stone. He sat up slowly, the taste of stale whiskey coating his tongue, the sheets tangled around his legs, and he told May Pang that he was done, that he would not drink again, that this birthday would mark the beginning of something clean. The decision felt monumental, almost sacred, and for the first 3 months it held, each day a small victory carved out of the wreckage of his habits. Yet the sobriety was fragile, a thin sheet of ice over a lake that still churned below, and when the winter came the old patterns crept back like shadows reclaiming a room. He tried again and again, but the bottle was a patient lover, waiting for the moment when his resolve would soften. On August 28, 1974, the phone rang with news that hit him harder than any hangover. Neil Young and Joni Mitchell, friends, peers, fellow travellers through the muddy waters of fame, had both been hospitalised for substance abuse. Lennon later called that day the worst of his life, not because of what happened to him, but because of what it showed him about the fate that awaited them all. He sat in the dim light of the hotel room, staring at the wall, his hands trembling, as he tried to process the fact that the people he had admired, the ones who seemed to have found a way through the noise, were just as lost as he was. For days after, he spoke in fragments, asking Pang if she thought he would end up like that, if the road he was on would lead him to the same sterile white room, his body failing, his mind unmoored. The question hung in the air, unanswered, because neither of them wanted to speak the truth aloud. That summer had offered a glimpse of something else, a brief flicker of the man he used to be. On June 1, 1974, he walked onto the set of The Mike Douglas Show as a guest host, the microphone familiar in his hand, the cameras rolling, and for those hours he seemed almost like the old Lennon, chatting and joking, a ghost of the man the world thought it knew. He laughed at his own jokes, bantered with the other guests, and for a moment it was easy to forget the chaos that surrounded him off-screen. But the performance was just that, a performance, and when the lights went down and the applause faded, he returned to the same room, the same bottles, the same spiral. The money continued to bleed out at a staggering rate, an estimated $500,000 vanishing into the smoke of parties and the bottom of glasses, a figure that would exceed $3 million in today's currency, all of it spent on feeding the very fire that was consuming him. The silence in that Manhattan coffee shop in January 1975 was louder than any concert crowd Lennon had ever faced. He sat across from Ono, his hands wrapped around a cup he never touched, and the 10 minutes that passed felt like hours, neither of them speaking, the air thick with everything they had not said to each other for 18 months. When the tears finally came, they came without warning, spilling down his face as if a dam had broken, and Ono reached across the table, her fingers closing around his hand with a gentleness that stabbed at him. Pang watched from a distance, and later she wrote that in that moment she knew she had lost, not because of anything said or promised, but because of the way he looked at Ono, like a man who had been drowning and had just seen land. The encounter planted a seed, and when February arrived, Ono called with her claim of a cure, and Lennon returned to the Dakota building, walking away from Pang and the chaos as if waking from a long fever. But those 18 months had left their marks, invisible yet permanent, and the scars would shadow every step he took in the years that followed. The silence that followed the lost weekend was the loudest thing John Lennon ever made. From 1975 until the end of 1980, he released only one record, the remarkable Double Fantasy, and the recorded history, according to the Discogs database, shows a creative desert where a torrent of ideas once flowed, proving the 18 lost months had cost him more than just his sobriety. The Beatles had officially disintegrated back in April of 1970, but the bitter truth, as documented in the Beatles anthology, is that even by that cold December of 1980, he and Paul McCartney had still not truly mended what was broken between them. And then the final cruel arc of the tragedy completed itself on the 8th of December, when, as the BBC News archives confirm, he was gunned down at the very threshold of the Dakota building, the same fortress he had once fled in confusion and despair. He spent a lifetime telling us that all you need is love, yet he could never quite figure out how to accept it himself, constantly looking for it in the wrong faces and the bottom of a bottle. Is the burden of genius so immense that the mind, to survive it, must first destroy the man who carries it? The story of those 18 months whispers that the great tragedy of John Lennon was not that he was killed, but that he had been quietly extinguishing himself long before anyone else got the chance. It was a slow, painful burnout that he mistook for a holiday, and perhaps the only lesson we can salvage from the wreckage is to recognise that same exhaustion in ourselves or in the people we love. Because if a man who once commanded the world's attention could vanish so completely into his own shadow, none of us are truly safe from disappearing too. Not even the soft yellow glow of a New York autumn could coax a single new song from his hands in those 5 silent years that followed. While the world waited with bated breath for a resurrection that never came, the man who had once poured out melodies like a restless river sat motionless in his Dakota apartment, watching the seasons change from behind a curtain of domestic routine. The only album he managed to release in that entire span Double Fantasy, surfaced in 1980 as a tentative, almost hesitant testament to a life relearned from scratch. Yet even its tender harmonies seemed to carry the faint echo of a man still piecing himself together from scattered fragments. His guitar gathered dust in a corner, his notebooks filled with grocery lists instead of lyrics, and each passing month stretched the silence a little wider, a little more permanent. You could feel it in the air of the studio when he finally returned. The hesitancy, the trembling hand reaching for a chord that used to come as naturally as breathing. As if the creative fire had been drowned in too many late nights of cheap whiskey and bitter regret. A childhood friend who visited him once recalled how John would stare at the piano for hours without touching a single key, his fingers hovering over the ivory like a ghost unsure of its place among the living. The Beatles' official dissolution in April of 1970 had severed a bond that neither he nor McCartney ever fully repaired, and the few phone calls they exchanged in that final decade were brief, awkward, laced with a tension that even the passage of years could not dissolve. The music that had once bridged Liverpool's working class with the world's stages now stood as a frozen monument to an era neither man could navigate back to, and both seemed trapped in its glittering wreckage. That December night, as the ambulance lights flickered against the Dakota's Gothic facade, the irony was unbearable. He had returned home to find safety, only to meet his fate on the very sidewalk from which he had once escaped. Does greatness demand such a terrible accounting? Or was this the price of never learning to rest before the mind breaks entirely? The question hangs there, unanswered, a haunting refrain for every artist who ever mistook self-destruction for inspiration. Maybe the real legacy of those 18 lost months is not the music that never came, but the quiet reminder that burnout wears many masks, disguising itself as freedom, as adventure, as a well-deserved break from the chaos of fame.